Welcome back to the Farm Show on Westplex Talk 104.5 FM. This is the C Block, our third segment for Saturday, February 21st, 2026. Last week, we heard about the Dicamba tolerance system. That's the Xtend system from Bayer. We heard about it via the Field Advisor podcast, the outstanding Field Advisor podcast hosted by Kelsey Litchfield. And we heard about it from folks from the Illinois Soybean Association, KJ to be exact, walked us through the dicamba label a little bit. Today we're going to hear from Bayer agronomist Lance Tarochione, and you can follow along with everything that Lance has to say by going to the DeKalb Asgrow Western Illinois page on YouTube. They do an outstanding series. We've talked about it many times before on this show. And this week, Lance was talking about the dicamba label, walked us through it a little bit. We'll get right into it. Lance talks about Stryax and dicamba applications. And as a bonus, Lance talks about why he focuses on agronomic recommendations on Ask the Agronomist and doesn't spend the whole time shilling Asgrow and DeKalb products. Have a listen.
It's a complicated label because if you don't know it, Stryax is dicamba. So Stryax is the name of the new dicamba formulation for use in over-the-top use. And as we've talked before, over-the-top is I kind of wish that's not what we called it because that makes everybody think of post-emergence applications. And so when we talk about over-the-top dicamba products, those are products that were developed for use in dicamba tolerant soybeans. So our Xtend and now our Xtend Flex, and in the future our Viconic soybeans and cotton. So just because they're referred to as the over-the-top formulations, that doesn't exclusively refer to post-emergence applications, and that gets a little confusing for people. So we received the federal label for Stryax in the last few days. State labels are pending. So unless it happened overnight, we do not have an Illinois state label. So I'm going to be very, very, very respectful of the fact that we do not currently have a state label. So we are not selling here. We are not promoting here. We are informing, educating, teaching, instructing here. So this is not sales and promotion. We don't do sales and promotion on Ask the Agronomist anyway. If anybody wants to fact check that, you can look back at a lot of previous episodes, and it's actually rare that I mention one of our products by name. I get feedback from salespeople saying, "Yeah, hey, well, talk about stuff more." This is agronomy. This is not sales. Now I do any decent agronomist is actually generally a halfway competent salesperson. So there's obviously if I told my kids because all my kids have at different times told me I don't want to do sales. Well, bad news for you kids. I don't see any way that you can get through life without selling. You're either going to sell a product, you're going to sell yourself, you're going to sell a concept. You're going to have to motivate people. You're going to have to lead people. You're going to have to persuade people. And bad news is all that kind of involves sales. But
okay, well, that's a little bit more fatherly or maybe even grandfatherly advice than we had bargained for. Thanks for that, Lance. Lance mentioned Stryax at the beginning, but whatever happened to XtendiMax?
So why are we talking about Stryax and not XtendiMax? So XtendiMax was the first trade name for our over-the-top dicamba formulation that launched several years ago and has had a infamous past, let's say, with labels that you get a label and then you get a different label and then it changes and then a label gets vacated and then it comes back and then it's vacated and it's been frustrating for people to navigate the for us too. To navigate, that product in the marketplace. And so people thought it was time for a change, just leave the old name and maybe some of the old baggage with the old name behind and come up with a new name. And actually, I think the new name is cooler than the old name, so it's got that going for it. It is in fact the same formulation. So we have not changed the product. We have changed the name, and I like the new name, and we're being very transparent about that.
Okay, so that makes sense. Get rid of some of the baggage by getting a new name. All right, Lance, tell us a little bit about the new Dicamba label and what you know so far.
It's a 2-year label. You might remember at one point in time we had a formulation that had a 5-year label. We didn't make it through all 5 years, so it was kind of irrelevant that we had a 5-year label. And some people have been a little concerned about, well, why is it only 2 years, and what's going to happen at the end of that 2 years? We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow in some cases. So I'm not particularly troubled by the fact that it's a 2-year label. That does put a little more of a burden on us to, we know in 2 years, hopefully in 2 years, we're going to need to re-register the product. And every time you register a product, you go back through the process. And for a registrant, which is the fancy term for the companies that develop and sell the products, the less often you have to do that, the better. But you customers don't really care about that. That's your problem, Bear. You deal with that, and we will deal with that. So for the next 2 years, knock on wood, this is the label we have, and it's a pretty good label, to be honest with you. There's always a few surprises. There's things we ask for. There's things EPA asks for. There's a little bit of back and forth, a little bit of discussion. And then when the final label comes out, there's usually a few things that are like, well, where'd that come from? We didn't ask for that, and you didn't ask for that, but now here it is. And so there's a few of those things in here, and we'll talk about those. But there's a lot of things to be excited about, a lot of things for me to be proud about with this label. First and foremost, we have one. And I think a lot of you out there probably really were starting to doubt we would ever get it. We've been pretty confident since we lost the last one, that we would have a new label. And it took a little longer than we had hoped to get it, but we have a new label. And even more of you thought that we would never, ever, ever, ever again, and at one point in time, I was in this camp as well, have a label that allowed post-emergence applications of dicamba and soybeans.
Okay, so as mentioned, Lance's territory is across the river in Illinois. And so Lance talks in detail about a few Illinois-specific topics. There are, of course, state-specific regulations, and we'll hear more about Missouri's in the weeks to come. We'll pick up with Lance talking about training requirements for the use of dicamba.
There will be, there's still annual training requirements. So if you're going to use a dicamba product, in crop, our competitors will have their products in the marketplace again as well. Don't ask me any questions about competitive products because I can't answer those. You need to talk to those cats about their stuff, not this cat. So the training requirement is not in person as it used to be, at least not in Illinois. There are some states that do still require in-person training. And I believe we will offer in-person training. Now they'll probably be on a limited basis. It'd probably just be when the customer asks us to. So I do work with some retailers that in the past have preferred to do in-person trainings, and I prefer them as well. You learn a lot more in an in-person training than you will doing it online, but it's pretty convenient, pretty easy to do it online, and that meets the requirement. So for the past few years, for the past 2 years, there's been no need to do one because there's been no product. Prior to that, we had gone to mostly virtual trainings, and that's what most people were doing. There will still be a need for a training. I think there will be on a localized basis. We're not going to be doing the big, huge ones like we used to do. I mean, we used to do them with 1,000 people in a room in a big hall somewhere, because back in the day, everybody had to go to an in-person training. But they pretty quickly, COVID kind of helped change all that. And since then, most trainings have been done virtually, and most trainings will continue to be done virtually. But I have had a few people ask me, "Hey, if we want to do a in-person training for our applicators and our salespeople, and maybe some of our growers who are self-applied, can we do that?" Yes, talk to your CP, your local CP rep, talk to your local agronomist, and I think we will be able to facilitate that. But I have not had my train the trainer training yet, so I am an unlicensed trainer at this point, and that's a no-go for the folks in St. Louis.
Oh gosh, Lance, I know exactly what you mean. I remember what it was like to have to deal with those people in St. Louis. If you're just joining us, you're listening to the Farm Show here on Westplex Talk 1045 FM. We're hearing Lance Tarochione, who's the noted agronomist right across the river in Illinois. There's an outstanding show called the Decalb Asgrow Western Illinois Ask the Agronomist. I should say you can find it at Decalb Asgrow, Western Illinois, on YouTube. Lance goes through on a regular basis and gives agronomic updates. We'll pick up with Lance talking about a big change in the previous label. The previous label for XtendiMax was the amount of dicamba that could be applied every year. He also defines the row and go approach with a special cameo by acetochlor.
So one of the changes that was made is the amount of dicamba that we're allowed to apply in a season has been reduced to 1 pound total AE, which would be the equivalent of 2 half-pound applications. So the 22 ounce per acre use rate that you're familiar with XtendiMax, Stryax is going to be the same use rate per acre. So the one and only labeled use rate for Stryax is 22 ounces, and you can spray 22 ounces twice. If you use anything less or more than 22 ounces, that's an off-label application. And it always has been. That we've always had that 22 ounce use rate. We used to have a 44 ounce pre-emergent rate. That went away a few years ago. We used to be allowed to use 2 pounds in season. So in theory, you could have sprayed 44 ounces pre and 22 ounces post twice and been within that 2 pound per use season label. We're now going to be limited to 1 pound per season, and that's fine because I don't really want to spray it more than twice anyway. If you the way I look at that, if you use dicamba in a burn down, or you use dicamba pre, which I love doing, that's your first 22 ounces. And then you're going to come back early post with your second 22 ounces. And then, heaven forbid, your field is not absolutely perfectly nuclear clean and you want to make a cleanup application, you're not going to be able to use dicamba to do that. But I would argue that Roundup and Liberty would be a far better choice for that third pass than something that included dicamba would ever be, especially if you're trying to clean up some escapes. If it's a new flush, that's a different situation. But a lot of times what we're retreating are weeds that we didn't quite get completely killed the first time. And if you're trying to kill a weed that's been roughed up by dicamba but not killed, more dicamba is not the best thing to use to control that weed. Liberty would actually do the job better anyway. So if we do need to make that third pass, it's going to be with Roundup or Liberty or Roundup and Liberty tank mix. There won't be any dicamba in that third pass if you've already used dicamba twice in that growing season. Now, some people are going to be, very excited since we have post flexibility back. That once again enables some people's favorite program that became known as row and go. And that row and go approach is you basically works best if you do a fall burn down. If your field is clean in the spring and clean enough to plant without making a pre-emergent application, some people like to plant their beans, let them get up a little bit, and then come in there with a Roundup, dicamba, and something like a Warrant or a Warrant Ultra, or something that, a residual product that can be, or to to play fair. Zidua product, as long as it doesn't contain, a pre-emergent PPO or metribuzin, because those can't be applied post, you can one pass do Roundup, Dicamba, and some residual early post, and then you're probably going to need a second post pass after that. That's, there is no such thing as one pass soybean weed control. And then in that second pass is going to be a little later in the growing season. Might be a little harder to use dicamba in that second pass. We'll talk about that. While we have the ability to use dicamba post again with the new label, you're not going to be able to use dicamba all summer long, and rightfully so. Too many bad things happen if we're spraying dicamba later in the summer in the growing season. So, we've been very consistent on that. It's easiest to use pre and early post, and that's going to continue to be our message.
Okay, and with the time remaining that we have this morning, we'll play one more clip from Lance to get super practical. It has to do with volatility reduction agents and drift reduction agents, what the new label says. Lance says it was actually a surprise to him.
We had not asked for this. To my knowledge, nobody told us they were thinking about doing this. But with the previous label, we had vapor guard protection in XtendiMax, and all of the manufacturers had developed formulations that were lower volatility. That was really the only difference in these dicamba formulations versus generic or products like Clarity. It was either a different salt that was a little less volatile, or it had an additive in the formulation that made it less volatile. And so the reduced volatility was the big difference in these products, and they had achieved that lower volatility by different ways. Well, with the last label, we got a new requirement to add additional volatility reduction agent, VRA, as they're known, to the spray tank. So the regulators made the decision that, okay, you guys have made your products lower volatility. We don't think they're low enough volatility. We need to control volatility more than we have been. We need to add additional VRA to the tank every load of spray that goes out. And that depended on what tank mix you were doing, and it depended a little bit on what the tank mix partner was. And so there was some complexity in that. And I believe the use rate that was required of those VRAs was 20 ounces. Well, just to try to offer even more protection against volatility, and I won't get on my soapbox about how volatility is not generally the biggest problem we have. But anyway, now the ask, or it's not an ask, it's a requirement, it's in the label. No wiggling around this, is 40 ounces of VRA with every application. So we're actually going to be using almost twice as much volatility reduction agent as we are Stryax. And that's going to be something that kind of complicates the system a little bit. You're going to need to have some sort of storage container that's fairly large to hold your adjuvant that has to go in the tank, because 40 ounces of a liquid product to add to the tank that's a lot. And that's probably something that our retail applicators in some cases will struggle with, because they may need to have an adjuvant in bulk, and I'm not sure anybody's used to having an adjuvant in bulk. That's going to be a little bit of a tricky one that we'll have to work through. People have to get their head wrapped around that. We're still in the process of getting our head wrapped around that.
All right, we've got to cut Lance off there because we're right up against time. So much more if you go to the YouTube page for DeKalb Asgrow, Western Illinois, and the Ask the Agronomist series. Thanks for joining us this week. You can find all of our archives by going to YouTube and searching for Farm Show Radio. We'll see you next week at 10 a.m.